Good afternoon, friends. Thank you. And thank you for being here. My name is Dan Philpott. I'm a professor in political science. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of Carter Sneed, who's, of course, is still sitting right here, and will be leaving early, as well as Patrick Deneen, respectively Director and Acting Director of the Center for Ethics and Culture. And again, I'm Dan Philpott, Professor of Political Science and a member of the Center's Faculty Advisory Committee, as well as Director of Under Caesar's Sword, a research project that is housed with the Center. As you know, the Center for Ethics and Culture is dedicated to promoting the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition, both here on campus and in the public square, through a variety of programs and events like this one. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Mary Eberstadt, who will be speaking about the prophetic power of Humanae Vitae. Here to introduce Dr. Eberstadt is one of the Center for Ethics and Culture's undergraduate Soren Fellows, Keenan White. The Soren Fellows program at the Center gives both undergraduates and graduate students an opportunity to be more involved in the life of the Center, as well as special access to guest speakers, mentorship by our affiliated faculty, and funding opportunities for internships, research projects, and service work around the globe. If you're a Notre Dame student interested in learning more about the program, Pete Halabsi, our student program manager, would be more than happy to talk with you after today's lecture. Is Pete here? Do you want to? Oh, hi. Great. There's Pete. Thank you, Pete. Good. Very good. Let me now turn the podium over to Keenan, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Good afternoon. Like Professor Philpott said, my name is Keenan White, and I'm a junior here at Notre Dame and a Soren Fellow with the Center for Ethics and Culture, and it's my pleasure to introduce today our distinguished speaker, Mary Eberstadt. Author and cultural critic Mary Eberstadt is a senior fellow of the Faith and Reason Institute and formerly a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute and the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Her writing has appeared in Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, National Review, First Things, and The Weekly Standard, among other venues. She is the author of several best-selling books, including Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution, published in 2012, and It's Dangerous to Believe, Religious Freedom and Its Enemies, published in 2016. We are delighted to have Eberstadt here today with us to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI's encyclical reaffirming the traditional Catholic anthropological teaching on the exclusive, permanent, conjugal relationship of marriage as the fundamental building block of society. An encyclical that Eberstadt calls, in a recent First Things article, the most globally reviled and widely misunderstood document of the last half-century, and also the most prophetic and explanatory of our time. Please join me in welcoming Mary Eberstadt.
Thank you. Thank you, Keenan. Thank you, everyone, for that warm welcome. It's a wonderful honor to be here in this historic stronghold of American Catholicism, and to put our heads together and reflect on what universities are made to reflect upon, which is truth and what it looks like and whether we know it when we see it. Let me start with a few words about my interest in our subject here today. I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, so this is not an exercise in those august subjects. In fact, it's quite the contrary. For reasons that I hope to impress, it's precisely in leaving aside these accustomed tools for measuring the truth of the Catholic teaching and in picking up new secular tools that the beauty of the document before us shines forth in a new way. By way of background, like many people who have been writing here and there for a while now, I have diverse intellectual and literary interests, and for some time it has been apparent that the sexual revolution that began in the 1960s bids fair to become one of the most formative disruptions in human history. It's having massive repercussions around the world, microcosmic, macrocosmic, religious, moral, social, political, and otherwise. This ongoing fallout, to me, is one of the greatest intellectual puzzles of our time. So I've been trying here and there to put some of the pieces together. 10 years ago, on being asked to write an essay for what was then the 40th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, I surveyed evidence from a variety of sources about the predictions in that document and the way that those predictions were mapping onto reality. Citing data from sociology, psychology, history, contemporary women's literature, and other sources, I concluded then, not only have the document's signature predictions been ratified in empirical force, but they have been ratified as few predictions ever are, in ways that its authors could not possibly have foreseen, including by information that didn't exist when the document was written, by scholars and others with no interest whatever in its teaching, and in more ways than one, by public adversaries of the Catholic Church. Today, I would like to revisit that foregoing analysis with new evidence from the last 10 years alone. And I would like to do so mindful of the spirit that Pope Francis and his closest associates now bring to the Church. One recurring theme of their teaching is that human realities trump abstractions, that la realidad es superior a la idea, as the Holy Father puts it. Related cautions about rigidity, empty rhetoric, and getting stuck in pure ideas also appear often in his work and in that of similar teachers. What matters most are the realities that people face in their daily lives, quote unquote, as Blaise Cardinal Supich put it in a speech at Cambridge University recently. Another theme we hear often is discernment and the need to use our reason and our consciences in light of reality. As Father Jenkins has recently described it, quote, discernment, which has a long history in the Catholic spiritual tradition, is a process of weighing thoughtfully considerations for and against various courses of action, unquote. Now, both this emphasis on reality and the call to discernment are essential to understanding our subject today, which is the prophetic nature of Humanae Vitae. Of course, to say that an argument is valid and prophetic is not to say that people are always happy to hear it. Not 50 years ago, not 10 years ago, and often not today. That's especially true of this argument concerning church moral teaching. The promise of sex on demand, unleashed by the sexual revolution, unencumbered by constraint, may be the strongest collective temptation that humanity has ever encountered. And that's exactly why, since the invention of the birth control pill, resistance to traditional teaching has been unremittingly ferocious, and why so many in the laity and clergy wish that this rule, among others, were less taxing. But even so, to confuse hard with wrong is a fundamental error. If we are truly to lean into reality, if we are truly to discern and weigh thoughtfully considerations for and against courses of action, there's only one conclusion to be drawn from the mass of empirical evidence now out there. It's the same conclusion that was visible 10 years ago and that will remain visible 10, 50, or 100 years from now. The most globally reviled and widely misunderstood document of the last half century is indeed the most prophetic and explanatory of our time. And nobody needs a theology degree to understand this. The evidence of our senses will be enough, as I hope to show. So let's set aside theology, philosophy, ideology, politics, and all other abstractions, and count up the new realities vindicating Humanae Vitae, and by extension, the 2,000 years of church teaching that it reiterates. Let's discern what that record means for what a Catholic and others should think and do from here. The first empirical reality is this. If we leave aside individual intentions and assess nothing but uncontroversial data, it is transparently clear that the increased use of contraception has also increased abortion. That is not a theological or ideological statement. It is a factual one, and it's grounded in arguments mounted by perfectly secular social science, as we will see. Let's consider 4 different proofs for this claim. To begin, 50 years ago, when contraception became commonplace, many people of goodwill defended it, precisely for the reason that they thought it would render abortion obsolete. This was also Margaret Sanger's stock in trade. Reliable birth control, it seemed reasonable to assume for many, would prevent abortion. But the statistical record since the 1960s shows that this commonly held logic is wrong. Precisely for the reason that many people expected the opposite result, economists and other social scientists have been dissecting this puzzle. Far from preventing abortion and unplanned pregnancies, contraception's effects after the invention of the pill ran quite the other way. Rates of contraception usage, abortion, and out-of-wedlock births all exploded simultaneously. Why? Well, writing in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, also not a theological vessel, 22 years ago, economists George Akerlof, Janet Yellen, and Michael Katz offered one secular analysis of this unexpected result. They summarized, quote, "Before the sexual revolution, women had less freedom, but men were expected to assume responsibility for their welfare. Today, women have more freedom to choose, but men have afforded themselves the comparable option. If she's not willing to have an abortion or use contraception, the man can reason, why should I sacrifice myself to get married? By making the birth of the child the physical choice of the mother, the sexual revolution has made marriage and child support a social choice of the father," unquote. In other words, contraception led to more pregnancy and more abortion because it eroded the idea that men had responsibility for an unplanned pregnancy. Contraception, as these economists explain, sharply reduced the incentive for men to marry, and that included marrying their pregnant girlfriends. In the new post-pill order, pregnancy became the woman's responsibility, and if birth control, quote, failed, that was not the man's problem. So, proof 2. Another economist, Timothy Reichert, delivered a different but related econometric analysis of this same puzzle 10 years ago, on the 40th anniversary of Humanae Vitae. He used microeconomic reasoning to make a number of points about the damages of the sexual revolution, which he argued had resulted in a massive redistribution of wealth and power from women and children to men. Contraceptive technology, he also showed with all the requisite charts and measures that I'm sparing you, but that you could look up in his essay, increases demand for abortion. Now, Reichert is a very important piece of analysis, especially today in a moment when many people, including in the church, may not yet know what analytical science has been demonstrating about these connections for decades now. If the established links between contraception and abortion were truly to be absorbed by all Catholics, that knowledge would have the potential to erase the long-standing and divisive rejection by so many of the Church's teaching against birth control. Let me quote a critical piece of Reichert's analysis here. He writes, "Contraception creates a demand for abortion. The negative ramifications of childbearing on labor market participation for women means that women rationally plan their human capital investments around childrearing in the later phases of life. When things go awry and threaten their investments, they demand abortions. The cost today of an unwanted pregnancy is not a shotgun wedding. Rather, it is the loss of tremendous investments in human capital geared toward labor market participation during the early phases of one's life. That increases the demand for abortion," unquote. Proof 3. There is also the fact that contraception and abortion are bound together ineradicably as a matter of law, at least in the United States. As Michael Pekulik, among other scholars, has recently pointed out, quote, "As regards jurisprudence, the fruit of contraception is abortion. Until the 1960s, Comstock Act laws were on the books in many states, making the sale of contraceptives illegal, even to married couples. These were overturned with the Griswold decision of '65. By '73, only 8 years later, the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade had inferred from the right to contraception a right to abortion," unquote. Putting that point in layman's terms, legal reasoning justifying freedom to contracept has also been used to justify abortion. You can't have one without the other, not in American law anyway. And this is one more linkage that undermines the idea held by many people in 1968 that a hard and fast line can be drawn between these two practices. Proof 4. Historical reality also connects the same causal dots between contraception and abortion. The push to liberalize abortion laws in countries around the world does not begin until the first third of the 20th century as birth control devices come into wider circulation. American states do not start liberalizing abortion laws until after the federal approval of the birth control pill. Roe versus Wade comes after the pill, not before. As a matter of historical fact, the mass use of contraception called forth the demand for more abortion. Writing in the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly in 2015, researcher Scott Lloyd likewise concluded that this causal link exists. Not inevitably in individual cases, of course, but repeatedly and reliably as twinned social phenomena. He says, quote, "Because the lower risk perceived with contraceptives enables sexual encounters that would not occur otherwise, it invites pregnancies in situations where women do not feel ready to become pregnant," unquote. So let's draw back from the proofs. 50 years ago, people had an excuse for not knowing these things. But 50 years later, we can discern otherwise. How many students out there are pro-life? This is Notre Dame. If you could do one thing to diminish abortion in America, wouldn't you do it? What if that one thing were to be to refuse to give any quarter to the contraceptive culture or to spread contraceptives in your society because you wouldn't want to thereby contribute to more abortion? It's a hard truth, but it is a truth, and the arithmetic of history proves it. With discernment comes responsibility. Many well-intentioned human beings, including many Catholics, have joined the contraceptive culture in varying degrees of complicity with the idea that they can keep a Berlin Wall between these things. And they have every intention of doing so. But that wall is porous. Empiricism shows it. The Berlin Wall itself fell down, and so does the supposed wall between contraception and abortion. Now, note that not one word of this analysis impugns or judges anybody. It's not theology we're talking about here. It's the record of empirical fact. In fact, if anything, this analysis agrees that people back in 1968 couldn't have known any better. As we review the record, mercy and forgiveness are obviously on it, toward the post-war generation that championed contraception, that is. Because who back then could have anticipated that it would lead to abortion on a scale never before seen? You know, to review these facts is also to feel a pang about how much more united Catholicism might have stayed after the 60s if only people had known then what the record shows now. Might not at least some dissenting Catholics and others who publicly rebuked the Church for Humanae Vitae have acted differently if they had known the result? At a minimum, it is plain looking back that the lowering of moral standards predicted by Humanae Vitae would come to include not only disrespect for women, which that document prophesied, but also for the human fetus. Now, Pope Francis himself has called abortion a very grave sin and a horrendous crime. Many, presumably most, Catholics agree. And if this is so, then it matters that participating in the first enhances the other. 50 years ago, a lot of people didn't know that smoking caused lung cancer, or probably more precisely, they didn't want to believe the evidence. But the accumulation of 50 years of data forced a new consensus about tobacco, including among people who smoke. Evidence that contraception is an accelerant to abortion should do the same for Catholics. So now let's talk about a second, more hopeful reality out there that the last 10 years especially have also unveiled. In part because 50 years of experience have established the first reality we were just talking about, meaning the truth that the contraceptive revolution would never be limited to contraception. Another reality has also become relevant. People outside the Catholic Church, including, most notably, some leading Protestants, have come to see Humanae Vitae and related teachings in a new and more favorable light. This, I think, is one of the least reported and potentially most consequential religious stories of our time. And it has the power to reconfigure Christianity itself in the future, replacing yesterday's disunity over birth control with a new unity about the toxicity of the sexual revolution. Observing what industrial sex has wrought, more and more Protestant voices now question yesterday's nonchalance. This reconsideration is far from a majority view, at least yet, but it manifests what any minority view must have to win over converts. It has evidence behind it, and it has moral energy. Here are just a few quotes from the last 10 years alone. From a professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, quote, "Protestants have done themselves a disservice by ignoring Humanae Vitae's substantial statement on human anthropology and sexuality. Protestants would be well served to study Paul VI's encyclical and take heed of its warnings." Unquote. R. Albert Mohler, Jr., Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, quote, "Many evangelicals are joining the discussion about birth control and its meanings. Evangelicals arrived late to the issue of abortion, and we have arrived late to the issue of birth control. But we are here now," unquote. An anthropologist at Messiah College notes, quote, "For evangelicals, an anti-contraception position is not seen as exclusively Roman Catholic as it was in the past," unquote. And as the New York Times noted in a headline in 2012, quote, More Protestants oppose birth control, unquote. Now, these second thoughts among Protestants and other non-Catholics are less a radical break from Christian teaching than a return to it. Church teaching on contraception, including Protestant teaching, has followed an unbroken line through the centuries. Not until the Anglican Communion made the first exception to the prohibition at the Lambeth Conference of 1930 did Catholics and Protestants divide on this in the first place. The famous Resolution 15 was intended for married couples only and in carefully delineated circumstances, but it ended up ushering in contraception for convenience anyway. It's worth looking at the language of that resolution for a moment at a time when many would like the Catholic Church to take the same path. Resolution 15 said, "In those cases where there is such a clearly felt moral obligation to avoid or limit parenthood, and where there is a morally sound reason for avoiding complete abstinence, the conference agrees that other methods may be used, provided this is done in light of the same Christian principles." Unquote. Now, back in 1930, as in 1968, many people of goodwill thought that they could hold the line on contraception, that they could square the circle around the opposed poles of Christian moral teaching on one side and technologies that would devastate the human family on the other. But just as some prophetic Catholics in 1968 saw the wreckage coming, so did some prophetic Protestants in 1930. The conference was divided about Resolution 15. It ultimately passed, but with strong dissent. Charles Gore, the Bishop of Oxford, wrote that he had manifold reason, as he put it, to believe that in the case of birth prevention, the very strong tradition of the Catholic Church has been in the right and has divine sanction, unquote. Either way, whether their forebears were right or wrong back then, some Protestants and others outside the church now are doing what we're doing here. They're reflecting on the empirical record and concluding that the Catholic Church was right. So this brings us to a third reality made plainer by the last 10 years, and one that I think is especially interesting. It's a place where social justice and the sexual revolution clash head on. Consider, in Africa, both Protestants and Catholics lean toward traditionalism in Christian moral teaching. It is in tradition-minded Africa that the church has grown explosively in the years since Humanae Vitae, as opposed to in those nations whose Christian leaders have struggled and struggle still to change the rule book. As the Pew Research Center put it in a report a few years ago, Africans are among the most morally opposed to contraception. Substantial numbers of people in Kenya, Uganda, and other sub-Saharan countries, Catholic and otherwise, agree with the proposition that it is morally unacceptable. In Ghana and Nigeria, that's more than half the population. Despite decades of secular proselytizing, many Africans have resisted the attempts of reformers to bring them into line with the secular Western program. Now, I would like to connect some dots here. It is obvious, if under-discussed, that one reason for this fidelity to traditional teaching is something else that Humanae Vitae saw coming, namely that the new technologies would be used in the attempt to keep certain populations down. This too is more discernible in hindsight. Nigerian-born Obianuju Ekiocha, author of the new book Target Africa, Ideological Neocolonialism of the 21st Century, wrote an open letter to Melinda Gates, whose foundation dedicates impressive resources to spreading birth control among Africans. She said, "I see this $4.6 billion buying us misery. I see it buying us unfaithful husbands. I see it buying us streets devoid of the innocent chatter of children. I see it buying us a retirement without the tender, loving care of our children." unquote. More on that point later. Contraceptive technology, as Paul VI foresaw, opens a Pandora's box of mischief in which the stronger have the advantage over the weaker. This is, to repeat, a fundamental question of social justice. Imagine you live in a world where the powerful believe that it would be a better world without more people like you in it. Imagine you have Down syndrome, and your government were to brag that they had all but eliminated the unwanted likes of you, as happened recently in Iceland. Or imagine you're living in a poorer and browner part of the world than the one many of us are used to, and that you're constantly on the receiving end of this message that the solution to your society's problems is generating fewer people who look like you. It only takes a small leap of empathy to grasp what that message might sound like to people on the other side, and why it makes sense that some of those people who are the target of such power naturally reject such a view. Do any of us believe the world would be better with fewer of us in it? And if not, why is it just to spread that message elsewhere in the world? It isn't only Africa. As one notable Indian, targeted with the same message some years back by Margaret Sanger herself, put it, quote, "It is futile to hope that the use of contraceptives will be restricted to the mere regulation of progeny. There is hope for a decent life only so long as the sexual act is definitely related to the conception of precious life," unquote. The author of those sentences is not the famous moral philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, whose essay in 1972 on contraception and chastity defended Humanae Vitae with exactly the same logic. The author of those sentences is Mahatma Gandhi, one more non-Catholic to affirm the reasoning behind Christian moral teaching. Moreover, people on the receiving end of today's desire to spread these technologies are also right to suspect that something questionable is afoot, because the last 50 years have revealed numerous attempts by public authorities, as Humanae Vitae predicted, to impose those technologies on the citizenry. This has happened most sickeningly in China via its long-standing barbaric one-child policy, replete with forced abortions and involuntary sterilizations. A softer kind of coercion has appeared here and there in the United States and other Western nations, where efforts have been made to link desired outcomes with mandatory birth control. In the 1990s and beyond, for example, some US judges backed state-imposed implantation of long-term contraception on women accused or convicted of certain crimes. Such implied force has even provoked criticism by the American Civil Liberties Union. Quote, "The recent attempts to coerce women to use Norplant represent a reversion to an era of overt racism and eugenics," the ACLU explained. So let's look at reality number 3. It concerns the state of modern women. Contraception, it was and is perennially asserted, will make them happier. Has it? Evidence points to the contrary, and much of it is in the essay I wrote 10 years ago, to which I refer you for more data. But I'll just summarize. There's social science suggesting that female happiness across the United States and Europe has been declining for some time. There are also the dolorous notes in academic and popular feminism to consider, and the growing outspoken worry among secular women that marriage has become impossible and it's time to go it alone. The most vivid exhibit to submit from the last 10 years is, of course, the Me Too movement. It appears, in retrospect, that the sexual revolution licensed predation. That is also not a theological judgment, but an empirical one. foreseen in part by the social scientist Francis Fukuyama. In 1999, his best-selling book, The Great Disruption, about the time since the 60s, makes the same point that echoes through Humanae Vitae, but based on a thoroughly secular analysis. He wrote, "One of the greatest frauds perpetrated during the Great Disruption was the notion that the sexual revolution was gender neutral, benefiting women and men equally. In fact, it served the interests of men, and in the end put sharp limits on the gains that women might otherwise have expected." What the hashtag #MeToo movement shows is that no longer does a man have to be a king or some master of the universe to prey upon women in unrelenting serial fashion. All he needs is a world in which women are assumed to use contraception. And that's the world we've had since the 1960s, the world that Humanae Vitae foresaw. This brings us to one more reality mentioned earlier. 50 years into the sexual revolution, one of the most pressing and growing issues for many suffering people is not overpopulation, as was feared in 1968. It is instead underpopulation. A great many people, especially in the increasingly barren and graying countries of the West, are suffering not from overcrowding and not from lack of resources, but from what experts in one stricken society after another call the epidemic of loneliness. Pope Francis knows about this. In an interview with La Repubblica in 2013, he called the loneliness of the old one of the worst evils in today's world. He's surely right. 50 years after the embrace of the pill, undeniably because of the embrace of the pill, loneliness is spreading across the materially better off countries of the planet. Right around Christmas last year, the New York Times published a summary from Japan, much of which I will spare you. But it included these notes: 4,000 lonely deaths a week. A lonely death means a solitary death with nobody else around. 4,000 a week. Each year, Japan's elderly die without anyone knowing, only to be discovered after their neighbor caught the smell. Mrs. Ito is mentioned, lying on the floor for 3 years without anyone noting the absence. Monthly rent and utilities had been withdrawn automatically from the bank. And finally, a skeleton was discovered near the kitchen. The story goes on to note that the extreme isolation of some elderly Japanese has called forth a new industry to go into the apartments of these lonelies and clean them up afterwards and dispose of their material possessions. There's even an insurance industry that's started to offer policies to protect landlords in case a lonely happens on their property. And Japan is only one country facing this kind of demographic post-revolutionary change. Le Figaro reported several years ago, loneliness is becoming a common phenomenon in France, with all the attendant charts. It's cited as the prime driver of the loneliness, family rupture, especially divorce. In 2014, a long study appeared in Portugal agreeing that divorce increases the likelihood of loneliness. What no one seems to have asked is whether having children in the picture might ameliorate this problem. And the fact that children are not even mentioned in this context, for the most part, tells us a lot about where we are. Even the secular culture is taking note of this. In Sweden, a very interesting 2015 documentary on called the Swedish Theory of Love questioned the dominance of independence in that country as an ideal. It seems more of a curse than a blessing when 1/2 of Swedes now live in households of one person. And again, a tragic story about a lonely death. And then there's Germany. In an article in Der Spiegel titled "Alone by the Millions, Isolation Crisis Threatens German Seniors," the German Center of Gerontology recently reported that over 20% of Germans over the age of 70 are in regular contact with only one person or nobody. 1 in 4 receives a visit less than once a month. To repeat, this human poverty is abounding in societies awash in material wealth. This too was not foreseen by those who argued for or against Humanae Vitae in '68, but without doubt what unites these tragic portraits is the sexual revolution, which has been operating at full throttle for decades now, driving down marriage rates, driving up divorce rates, and emptying cradles all over. It doesn't take a demographer to connect these dots. Just the evidence of our senses will do. In one of the saddest stories, and the one I'll close this section with from Der Spiegel, an elderly German lady is interviewed sitting on a park bench. Born shortly after World War I, 10 years later, her husband died, 10 years ago, her husband died. She has outlived all her siblings and girlfriends. It concludes, her husband didn't want any children. I should have insisted on it, said the former cook, and then maybe I wouldn't be so lonely. So, one more reality to ponder is historical. And it's worth reiterating at a time when hope burns eternal in certain precincts that the Catholic Church will cease its insistence on this supposedly retrograde doctrine of its. The churches that have accommodated themselves to the revolution have all imploded from within. As a headline in The Guardian put it simply 2 years ago, on the eve of yet another contentious conference at Lambeth, where African representatives of the Anglican Communion dissented once more from changing moral teaching, quote, "The Anglican schism over sexuality marks the end of a global church," unquote. Well, who in 2018 would want the same for the Catholic Church? In 1930, people would surely have been shocked if they had been told that the doctrinal war over sex would shatter the Anglican Communion, that parts of the Communion would go to legal war over churches and jurisdictions as well as over doctrine, that the separation of North and South, Episcopalian and Anglican, Africa and Europe would yield divisions and subdivisions, acrimony and sorrow on a global scale. In 1998, Bishop John Shelby Spong of Newark, New Jersey, a leader of the Episcopalian Church who urged an embrace of the revolution, published a book called Why Christianity Must Change or Die. He was agitating for more dismantling of the tradition. Well, the Christianity of which he spoke did change, and it did die. According to an analyst who charts numbers from the Anglican Communion from 1980 to the present, around 2000, serious decline set in. Average Sunday attendance dropped by nearly 1/3 between 2000 and 2015. The rate of baptism has been cut in half over a 30-year period, et cetera, et cetera. The point is that history shows that disaster descended on the Anglican Communion for doing exactly what dissenters from Humanae Vitae, well-meaning though they may have been, have wanted the Catholic Church to do: make exceptions to rules that people find difficult. And this too we can discern much more clearly in retrospect than when the rupture first began. Surely the first burden of anyone urging Rome to follow Lambeth's lead is to first explain why Catholicism's fate will be different. I would like to close on a hopeful note, because hope does abound in these 50 years later. To review what's happened in the last half century is not to sound a dirge. It's really the opposite. It's to empower the rest of us, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, going forward with knowledge that confused people didn't have 50 years ago. It's not a secret that these are challenging years for the Church. The sexual revolution is locked in mortal combat with 2 millennia of teaching that goes straight back to Jesus Christ. That's the bad news. But more and more people outside the church are concluding from that same wreckage that Catholic moral teaching has called many things right, not only as of Humanae Vitae, but for the previous 2 millennia of teaching. The tough but luminous consistency of that moral code has drawn in converts, ever since being mocked by the pagans of Rome and mocked by pagans in every era since then. That code has made St. Augustine's out of sinners in every age. It embodies a story about God and his people that to this day brings zealous converts into the church. And looking to the next 50 years, I think we can predict that it will continue to do so even more as the record of what happens in its absence becomes clearer and more documented with every year. To discern that record is to see that the Catholic Church was right to stand as a sign of contradiction to the devastation that the revolution would wreak, especially on the weakest and smallest shoulders. That accommodating the revolution has been an epic fail everywhere it's been tried, and that the truths of Humanae Vitae and related documents burn all the more brightly against the shadowy toll of the destruction out there. So, be proud, for those who are Catholics, in the right way, that your church got one of the most important calls in history right. And don't let anybody put a kick me sign on you for being an unapologetic Catholic. Thank you.